بسم الله بسم الله الحمد لله والصلاة على محمد رسول الله. So inshallah we'll continue with our second session of Ibn Khaldun. Last time we have talked about his family, their history as a prominent Andalusi family that of course survived also outside Al-Andalus. We talked about his education and that of course he was trained as a alim, but also that he was a politician and he has spent about 10 years in politics. And then we talked about his retreat when he wrote his masterpiece, the book that we are talking about, Kitab al-Ibar, before he went to Egypt, where he worked as Qadi al-Qudat, one of the Qadi al-Qudat, and also he updated his book to include the eastern part of the Muslim world, basically. And we introduced the book, and we said when we say the book, we mean more than al-Muqaddimah. So al-Muqaddimah is just a section of the book, and we talked about that it basically has, as you see, an introduction and book one, which both of them are what we call now al-Muqaddimah. They were never meant to be a book apart. So this is something that later scholars did, but for him that was just one book of three, and the second and the third book, they are history books proper. The first, as you can perhaps see, is Akhbar al-Arab, so it focused on the Arabs and other nations in their neighborhood, in the Romans, the Persians, the Indians, and so forth. And the third book is about the history of North Africa, and namely the Berbers, who are the natives of North Africa, and they ruled both in North Africa, Spain, and also to a certain sense in Egypt. And the third book is what he meant to write originally, but his book went beyond that, especially in its second edition. The first edition, we mean, is the one that he wrote in North Africa before he moved to Egypt. In Egypt, he updated the book, and we have now the final version, which is Kitab al-Ibar. So we'll focus, as we said, on the Al-Muqaddimah only, which is book one and the general introduction. Before that, we'll just have a look at the title of the whole book. The title is a little bit long, and it's what you have in the, so it starts as Kitab al-Ibar wa Diwan al-Mubtada'i wal-Khabar fi Ayyam al-Arabi wal-Ajami wal-Barbar وَمَنْ عَاصَرَهُمْ مِنْ ذَوِي السُّلْطَانِ الْأَكْبَرِ. It rhymes, which was the tradition at that time. And we'll take it step by step. So Kitab al-Ibar. So Kitab, obviously book. Then al-Ibar. So the word al-Ibar is the plural of the word Ibrah. And it is a Quranic word. So obviously Ibn Khaldun is very familiar with that. And what comes to mind is al-ibra in the story of Yusuf alayhi salam. لقد كان في قصصهم عبرة لأولي الألباب. So, and the fact that the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, obviously it's a story, it's part of history, but there is clearly the indication that there is a ibra there. There is a lesson to be learned. There is some teaching there. So Ibn Khaldun, he in a sense he go with the similar spirits, and that's why his book starts with Kitab al-Ibar. And just to dwell on the ayah, so it's a li'uli al-albab, so for those who think, and Ibn Khaldun will insist a lot on that. Then after Kitab al-Ibar, you have the second part. It starts Diwan al-Mubtada'i wal-Khabar. And the scholars, namely lately, meaning in modern time, they found this expression a little bit not too clear. Obviously, المبتدأ والخبر, it's usually a grammatical concept. Okay, you have المبتدأ and الخبر, but obviously Ibn Khaldun is not talking about grammar. It's not the topic, although he will occasionally mention it, and he has a small section about it, but that's not the topic, that's not the theme. So the المبتدأ والخبر should be taken rather in not in an istilahi sense, meaning in the terminology of grammar, but more of a literal meaning. So al-khabar here is key. So al-akhbar, for historians, you have one kind of historians are called al-akhbariyun, who really focus on what we call chronicles, meaning dates and events, but without much analysis. So that's al-khabar. However, Ibn Khaldun said there is a mubtada. And mubtada here perhaps it's better read as principle. And Ibn Khaldun, especially, we will see briefly that when he starts his book, he will talk about that stories, they have to fit in the norms, in the rules of history. Otherwise, they're suspects. They shouldn't be taken very seriously. We'll get back to that, inshallah. Then comes the proper topic of the book. So في أيام العرب, so it talks about the history of the Arabs, meaning an Arab here for Ibn Khaldun. Of course, we have what we might call the ethnic group, but also for him is a lifestyle. Then al-Ajam, non-Arabs, but usually at that time, what first came to mind usually at that time are the Persians, but of course that's not necessarily only the case. Then he's specific about a certain group, al-Barbar, which we said are the native speakers, or not the native speakers, the native inhabitants of North Africa. And since he meant first of all to write a history of North Africa, so that's why he focused on them. Then the last line there, وَمَنْ عَاصَرَهُمْ مِنْ ذَوِي السُّلْطَانِ الْأَكْبَرِ. So مَنْ عَاصَرَهُم, those who lived, they are contemporaneous with them. مِنْ ذَوِي السُّلْطَانِ الْأَكْبَرِ, meaning he will be speaking especially about the great powers, as-Sultan al-Akbar. So that's a little bit about the title, and we said that we are not going to study the whole book, and we are doing specifically what's known as al-Muqaddimah, which is in a sense the first two lines of the book, of the name of the book, the title, Kitab al-Ibar wa Diwan al-Mubtada'i wal-Khabar. Just to mention that after he talks about that, in the end he added to his book an autobiography known as At-Ta'rif. Now book one, which is what we are going to focus on, has three big chapters, and we'll mention them rather briefly. So في العمران البشري, that the first one is for العمران البشري على الجملة. So here al-umran is a concept that Ibn Khaldun will use a lot, and al-umran al-bashari, we talked about it, that sometimes it is translated as human civilization, al-umran al-bashari. That's one translation. The way he uses it, Ibn Khaldun also, sometimes he uses it in one expression as al-umran al-bashari wa al-ijtima' al-insani. Al-ijtima' al-insani. So al-ijtima' out of context is people coming together. Al-insani, of course, we are talking about people and not anything else coming together. And what's interesting that in modern Arabic, the word sociology is ilmu al-ijtima', which is the exact word that Ibn Khaldun uses. Naam. So the first section of the book will be talking في العمران البشري على الجملة. So that's the first chapter, meaning the general foundations of human civilization, which we'll be talking specifically during this session. Then for next time we'll see في العمران البدوي, which is human Al-Umran. Another layer of Al-Umran is quite similar to what modern social sciences called complexity, social complexity, meaning that when people come together and with the time, their relations, whether it is symbolic or material, it comes more and more complex. Now, so in the second chapter, he will talk about what happens in for tribes and in rural areas, obviously outside cities. Then the third one will be about statecraft في الدول والخلافة والملك. The fourth one is about city life and urbanism. Then في المعاش, which is about the economy, and the last one is about knowledge in the sciences. So these are the 6 chapters of book number 1. Now we said that al-Muqaddimah, yes, it is book number 1, but also the introduction that precedes it, which is في فضل علم التاريخ. Now we'll start في فضل علم التاريخ before we go to the subject of today. So the first thing that Ibn Khaldun talks about is that history for him is not, he will tell you from the very beginning, history is not for entertainment. History is a very serious subject. And especially if we remember that he's a politician, that you have to know even if you don't know the details of history, you have to know shall we say, the structure of history, the norms of history, so that you can make policy, and so that you can know how to conduct yourself and how to conduct the whole states. And so in here comes the issue of al-mubtada wal-khabar. So we said that al-khabar, so the reports that you reach, they have to fit norms that he will detail later. And for that, he will start criticizing historians that came before him. And for example, he said, because they didn't respect the rules of history, because they didn't respect the norms of human civilization, they sometimes, and he's quite tough, meaning he will say something like, so this is, when he's dealing with historians, he will say, okay, this is impossible. For example, he will give an example of a historian called Al-Mas'udi, an early Muslim historian. And he, for example, when Al-Mas'udi, the specific example that he starts with, the first example, is that, for example, Al-Mas'udi will be talking about the history of Islam, but also the history before Islam. And before Islam, for example, he will be talking about Musa alayhi salam, and he will say that when they crossed the Red Sea, when they crossed, meaning when they escaped Egypt, Musa alayhi salam, they counted how many they pretty much wanted to form some kind of an army. So he counted how many eligible young men there were, and Al-Mas'udi threw the number 600,000. And Ibn Khaldun just can, in a sense, said this is impossible. This is impossible. If he had just looked at Egypt, and because he said every country can just support a certain amount of an army. And in fact, sometimes just the number of people available to be soldiers is restricted by the size of the country, how much it produces of let's say wheat or whatever the staple is, and so forth. And he said that just can't be. And in fact, 600,000, just a side note that even in modern days, where Egypt is about 90 million people, it doesn't have an army that has 600,000 soldiers. So whether we agree with Ibn Khaldun or not, that's not the point. But the fact that he is using what sounds very rational calculations, and especially that he's a person who participated in many wars, so in a sense he's talking as an expert. Now, once again, whether that's true, his conclusion, whether it's true or not, that's not the point. But the point again, that he has norms that he's following in evaluating reports. Now, then, for example, a note, inshallah, for example, he will start giving examples of rules of history. So I will give you, this is a small paragraph that I wanted to read, and so it's في فضل علم التاريخ. So he has a section about قواعد فن التاريخ. So there are rules for writing history and understanding history. So I will read it, inshallah, and try to translate it, because it's an important little section. So he said, ومن الغلط الخفي في التاريخ الذهول عن تبدل الأحوال في الأمم والأجيال بتبدل الأعصار ومرور الأيام. ومن الغلط الخفي. So الغلط, so it's an error, it's a mistake, but it's a subtle error, it's a subtle mistake in writing history, is that الذهول is not paying attention that states, not in a political entity, that the situations, the conditions in nations and peoples, or you can read this also as generation, is not stagnant. It changes with the time and the passing of days. بتبدل الأعصار ومرور الأيام. وهو داء دوي شديد الخفاء. And this is a massive, he calls it a disease. شديد الخفاء, that it's very subtle. إذ لا يقع إلا بعد أحقاب متطاولة. Because change, meaning qualitative change, he's basically saying it's change happens little by little, and you don't, because you're living in daily life, generally speaking, you don't, especially in pre-modern times, you don't notice it, but it's happening. And after a couple of generations or so, there is a qualitative change. إذ لا يقع إلا بعد أحقاب متطاولة, after very long time periods. فلا يكاد يتفطن له إلا الآحاد من أهل الخليقة. Very rare people, very few people, الآحاد من أهل الخليقة, very exceptional people notice this change. وذلك أن أحوال العالم والأمم وعوائدهم ونحلهم لا تدوم على وتيرة واحدة. So the condition of the world and nations and their traditions and their beliefs, they don't stay the same. على وتيرة ومنهاج مستقر, they are not stable. إنما هو اختلاف على الأيام والأزمنة. So they change day by day and period by period. وانتقال من حال إلى حال, and they change from one condition to another. However, it takes a while to see a qualitative change. وكما يكون ذلك في الأشخاص والأوقات والأمصار فكذلك يقع في الآفاق والأقطار والدول. And this happens, and similar to the way it happens in individuals, people, and times and cities, it also happens in very wide areas, horizons, آفاق, والأقطار, countries, والدول, and states. And he said, سُنَّةَ اللَّهِ الَّتِي قَدْ خَلَتْ فِي عِبَادِهِ. This is Allah's way, which has been which passes or passed in His creation. So he said, subtle change, because later he will say that in his time, just a couple of centuries ago, it's as if the whole country changes. Remember that in his time, for example, he witnessed the Black Death, the Black Plague, and he said before the Black Plague and after the Black, it's as if they are completely two different countries. So that's maybe a little bit more sudden, but what he wants to focus here on are things that happen very subtle. They're very subtle, they're very slow. And by the way, this is, in modern archaeology, this is a key concept. And for example, a lot of times, especially in places, for example, pottery, ceramic, is one of those things that survive best in archaeological sites. And if you are not experienced, you will think the pottery, especially in pre-modern times where change is quite slow, you will think that the pottery from one century to the next, there isn't basically any difference. No, there is. And there is a whole work, it's called seriation and typology, where you put the ceramic. Thank you. So we were talking about ceramic, for example, is that you take ceramic from every age and you put them in a scale, and in the beginning you don't see much difference, but for example, let's say if you take 3 centuries and you take examples from every 20 or 25 years, once you put them according to the time period, from 25 years to 25 years, the difference is not much. However, once you see 3 centuries, the beginning and the end, the difference is great. So there is a difference. And now, of course, it's a whole specialty. The people who study that, they can now tell even the tiny differences. And that's one way of, for example, it's usually used for establishing chronology, establishing time periods. For example, if you find ceramic in a certain layer, and you can tell that ceramic which time period it comes from, and you compare it with other elements, and you gain an idea of the time period that you are excavating. So that, in a way, it's something that's now it's a daily usage. Now, so anyway, that's going back to the قواعد of فن التاريخ. So we talked. So we said that he has, when he present objections, he based them on norms, like what we said. For example, in Al-Mas'udi in Egypt, but for that specific example, he gives an objection to the same issue, but he will base it on a text. And he said that according to the best stories coming from the Jewish tradition, that the numbers were about something, were much lower. And I think somehow he mentions the number 25,000. And he said that was at the best time in the history of Bani Israel. Anyway, he makes a comparison to make sense, to tell us that that's not reasonable. Something else that he mentioned in Fadl Ilm al-Tarikh, that he will mention the Imam Bukhari as a historian. For him, Imam Bukhari, in at least some aspects, is a historian and a good one. And for example, it's perhaps easy to understand what he means. The fact that, for example, in the chain of transmission, where, for example, a certain muhaddith look at a certain chain of transmission, and he will look at two transmitters, two ruwah, and you said, okay, apparently the rawi number one, transmitter number one, has transmitted from number two. However, these people, they did not live in the same time. He said, when a historian, when a muhaddith objects, or at least raise this concern, he is, the idea here, inshallah, he is acting like a historian. Or, for example, in a similar concept, if, for example, there is a muhaddith object, or at least raise concern about a chain of transmission, because these two transmitters, although they lived during the same time, let's say one of them lived in Al-Andalus and the other one lived in Iraq, and they never met. That's also, he is acting like a historian. Hence, history is important. And of course, here it has huge consequences. Now, another rule that he mentions is, I will read this little quotation here, is that al-hadiru, the present time, يشهد لذلك, is a witness, is فالماضي أشبه بالآتي من الماء بالماء. So al-madi, the past, is similar to the future, to the coming. In fact, it's more similar to water compared to water, meaning they are basically the same. What does he mean here? He means that there are rules that they have, for example, water, you know, it should boil at a certain temperature. That rule should be the same regardless of the time period. Okay, so this concept is usually called uniformism, and uniformism is used in a number of sciences, for example, in geology. And it's an assumption, and I say here it's an assumption, that how things are now is how they were in the past. Generally speaking, that assumption works. There are exceptions, but generally speaking, it works. So Ibn Khaldun is telling us that's one of the rules of history that have to be respected. And in fact, the uniformism could help us understand, for example, his objection to al-Mas'udi's numbers for that supposed army. Now, so after Fadlu Ilm al-Tarikh is the introduction that we might come back to some of it later. He goes to the first book of Al-Muqaddimah, not Al-Muqaddimah, of Kitab al-Ibar, which we call Al-Muqaddimah. Now, so the name of that book one is في العمران البشري على الجملة, which are general concepts that should help us understand how does a human society work. And because once we get this, only then we can do history properly. Without respecting such norms, history, you know, it will become, as he would say, legends. Okay. Now, so in here he has 6 what he calls some muqaddimat, in the sense of premises or principles. Okay, we will go, some of them are related, so we are not going to spend too much time on them. And also the size of these premises, meaning as sub chapters, is not the same. So the first one is في أن الاجتماع الإنساني ضروري. Basically means that people coming together is a necessity. Okay, so now he will give us two examples. First of all is that, for example, he will say just for nutrition, which is a human need. And he will give an elaborate example. He basically say, okay, so for daily nutrition, let's assume you don't need much, but generally speaking, you might need at least one loaf of bread. And he will tell you, okay, just think about that, a loaf of bread. He will tell you, think about how much work, and especially how much tools were used to produce that one loaf of bread. He will say that if one man was to produce by himself that loaf of bread, meaning that man will have to produce all the tools necessary for grinding, let's say, for baking, and if you take it further, even for producing the wheat or the barley, and the time that's necessary. And he said that's practically almost impossible for one person to do. He said, but however, when people come together, and he will talk about getting specialized in production, you know, one person is a carpenter, one person is a farmer, one person is a potter, and so forth. They can produce in excess of what they need, and they can exchange what they have in excess for what they need, and that brings a general prosperity to the society as a whole. So that, he said, that's for nutrition. So that's why he said الاجتماع الإنساني ضروري. Then he gives another example. He said, okay, people need nutrition, but also they need, generally speaking, protection. And he said that for protection and defense, you need some kind of, generally speaking, you can't protect yourself by yourself all the time. So you need some kind of a contract, you need understandings, you need alliances, and that is based on the need for a hierarchy. Meaning you ultimately need, especially in the time of disputes, somebody who is able to judge, and mostly somebody who is able to carry on to the executive power. And he said that's why hierarchy is important and necessary. And he said not only that, we can see it even in the animal kingdom. So it's something very natural, hence necessary, which goes back to في أن الاجتماع الإنساني ضروري. So since human beings to have to have a basic life, they need to come together. Now, so that was the first muqaddimah, meaning the first premise, the first principle. The second one, he will dedicate it basically to geography. And what he's trying to tell us is that to understand the history, you have to understand geography. And that, in fact, the example again of al-Mas'udi comes to mind. That's because you have to understand the geography. And he will give us a conclusion of basically what's known in his time. It's almost the state of the art of geography at his time. And for example, he starts with the fact that شكل الأرض كروي. Okay, Earth is a sphere. You have to know that because it has implications. And then he will talk about, you know, basic geographical concepts, how in his time Earth was divided into 7 climes, الأقاليم السبعة. So climes, in fact, from where we get the English word climate, climates or climate. It's a Greek word originally, and so they basically divided Earth according to the latitudes in 7 basic bands, according to the main principle there is that they have similar climates, generally speaking. And then he started noticing certain things. Some of them, for example, he will tell us that most of human population is rather in the north, not in the south, which is still one reason. He will explain it why. One reason that a big portion of the southern hemisphere is oceans, of course there is, and a big portion also of course, in his time, the Americas, South America was not known, from what we can tell, and also south of the desert, of the Sahara Desert, was a little bit known, but not much. Regardless, most of people now, I believe, they still live north of the equator. So these are just little remarks, but for him, it's something that if you are a historian, you have to know. Because it will help you, it will equip you to judge reports that you reach. Now the 3rd, 4th, and 5th chapters, they're all related, and we'll start with the third. The third, it's في المعتدل من الأقاليم والمنحرف وتأثير الهواء في ألوان البشر والكثير من أحوالهم. Now he's talking about building on geography. He's talking about the climate, and he makes some interesting conclusions. Obviously, that the climate will determine your diet. It will determine to some degree your clothing, and it will determine your architecture. And these, for example, they were of course more obvious in pre-modern times, where, for example, in pre-modern times, the way people dressed, their architecture and cuisine were very distinct. And he said that part of the explanation is the climate. Now, he goes further. Okay, he will say he will have explanations that until the 19th century were at least accepted. Now they might be very contested, but for example, things like that al-hawa, meaning the air, the climate, you know, has an impact on how do people look, namely their colors. So that's, and he explained it, it's an adaptation. But sometimes his explanation, when they are criticized for being deterministic. So deterministic meaning that although it's a material explanation for either a material or physical phenomenon or even social. However, since it is deterministic, people are usually not comfortable with that because it doesn't leave a lot of room for free will. But for him, we have to remember that generally speaking, he has given us general norms, general rules, and sometimes he is quite clear that exceptions do exist, but you have to take the big picture first. If the narrative that you get fits in the big picture, you don't have a problem. If it doesn't fit, you have to stop because something is suspicious. Now he goes even farther, so which is the fourth section, the fourth chapter. في تأثير الهواء في أخلاق البشر. So he said that climate not only affects people physically, it affects their akhlaq, it affects their manners, it affects their sometimes it affects their morals, and sometimes it affects what we might call their personalities. So that might be controversial, but for him, this is, at his time, it seems to be a rule that you have to respect. And he will give some interesting explanations or examples. For example, he will be talking about hot countries, and especially hot and humid countries. He will tell you that hot countries, especially when it's hot and humid, people tend to like to move, and he will say, generally speaking, in these countries, for example, dancing is a big thing in their culture. And he relates that with the climate. And he will say, he will take it a little bit further. He said, just notice that, for example, that when people, they don't live in a hot and humid country, but if they are taking a shower, let's say, and it's hot and humid, people will start singing. Well, whether you think it's real or not, but the fact he's making a linkage between the what we may call the temperature, the climate, and human behavior. That's why modern people, especially so meaning before post-modernity, modern people really like the way he thinks. Okay, I mean, you can disagree with him, but you can see how he is making linkages between things that you sense and you can they're tangible. Now, then after that, he will be using some stereotypes about people that he knows. He will be talking about Egyptians, about people from Fez. For example, he will compare these two people. He says, for example, because of the humidity and the heat and whatnot. For example, they say Egyptians. It's a stereotype, so we don't mean to. For example, let's talk about two things. That, for example, فيهم خفة. خفة, for example, they like to joke. And similarly, it's a stereotype about Egyptians. And he said, that's from the climate. نعم. And he said, well, he said more than that. For example, that he said they tend to be a little bit rash. He will compare them with the people of Fez. So Fez is in the hills. It's a little bit cold. He said that, for example, the people of Fez, they tend to be very steady, very calculating. They plan. So the Egyptians, they don't do that. That's what's, whether it's true or not. It's definitely a stereotype. But the point for him that there is a connection between the weather, the climate, and how people behave. There might be exceptions, but he's giving you the general trend. Khair, inshallah. Now, then related to that is the fifth Muqaddimah, is the fifth premise, the fifth principle, which is related also to the climate. He said, في اختلاف أحوال العمران في الخصب والجوع وما ينشأ عن ذلك من الآثار في أبدان البشر وأخلاقهم. So it's related to the previous one. So human social complexity, human civilization is affected with whether the place is fertile or not, whether there is abundance or not, and abundance and when there is no abundance, all that has an impact on how people, on abdanul bashar, how people look, and on their manners. So, and here he will talk about, he will spend some time talking about the diet. which diet is healthy, which diet is not healthy, meaning diet of specific communities. We will be comparing, for example, the diet of Andalusis is different from the diet of North African, which is different from the diet of Egyptians, diet different from the diet of people who live in the desert. And he said, for example, will say why these people are more healthy or healthier, why the other people they are not. Anyway, the point that of course is obvious here, that diet affects people. It affects obviously their health. We don't disagree about that. But also diet affects how people behave, meaning their morals. And here he makes a note about diet and religiosity. He said that, which is in a sense something that you can control. And he said, for example, he will associate that people who are not too much into eating, they have a certain element. They are more prone. It's not deterministic. They are more prone to certain manifestations of religiosity, you know, like being an ascetic or and so forth. Now, then he will conclude with another section which is quite different. And here he will talk this is the last sub-chapter. في أصناف المدركين للغيب من البشر بالفطرة أو الرياضة ويتقدم الكلام في الوحي والرؤيا. So here he will go about how people, or at least some people, they have the potential to access al-ghayb, meaning we are not other ways, possible ways of knowledge which is not physical. And he said bil fitra, either by disposition, certain people are like that by disposition, or riyada, by training, meaning they work on it. And before that he will talk about the concept, or he will talk about what wahi is and what ru'ya is. And you see he shifted completely from the physical to what we can call the spiritual. Okay. And what's a side note here, that it's interesting that he will start by talking for a while. He will be talking, this is just a side note, he will be talking about the brain, about the human brain. And what's interesting, that at his time people already associated that certain parts of the brain are responsible for certain abilities, some of them physical, some of them emotional, and so forth. And it seems that people from that time, they deduced that from injuries to the brain. And of course, especially if there is a battle or accident, and certain people are hurt in a certain part of the brain, so certain faculties are hindered, and so that they made the connection. So they were surprisingly perhaps aware of the functions of the brain. So that's being put aside. He will start talking about. So this is perhaps the most difficult section in the first book, in the first chapter. So he will categorize people. أصناف نفوس البشر. So he will categorize. So people are categorized in three sections, or three categories. He talks about when it comes to their nafs. And he said that we have to understand that human beings are somehow in the middle. So they are at the pinnacle, on the top of the biological life. But they are obviously not in the realm of angels, but people are, there is a hierarchy even in there. The closest people to angels are al-anbiya, where they do have that experience. So that's the top. The lowest part is the common of people, and that those people, the maximum thing they can become is ulama. So it's something that they have to really study. In a sense, it's physical, it's acquired. It's acquired. So, and between the two, they are the awliya. And he said the experience of the awliya, the ulama can get it, the righteous people can get it, but that will be in the barzakh. So this is a very general explanation of that. Then he said he will talk about other potential sources of access in the ghaib. And so he will talk about al-kuhan, but he will tell us that their access to ghaib is through the wrong way, meaning it's through the shaitan. But that's basically exists in one way or another. Then there is another type, which is Ahlul Maghalit, the lower part there. Those people, they have no access to ghaib. They just pretend. They just fool the common people. Naam. Then he will talk about other people. For example, Al-Bahalid, which he will talk about certain people who look as if they are out of their minds, meaning they look like some kind of crazy people. He said, don't take them, don't be surprised that some of them do have access to ghaib, because they, in a sense, they are not. An idea that he touches upon, that the five senses sometimes seem to inhibit the access to ghaib, that if those five senses are somehow either controlled or diverted, there is a potential to access to the ghaib. So as you can see, that Ibn Khaldun is talking about both about the physical and about the non-physical. And in the very beginning, he will, when it comes to, because he will talk also about an-nubuwah. So prophethood, he takes it obviously very seriously. He will talk about it also in very beginning in في فضل علم التاريخ, I believe. Now, before I conclude, I will just talk about this plate, because it's basically a quotation. He will say basically, so Ibn Khaldun, we said after Fadl al-Tarikh, he said that you have to understand that you cannot understand history without understanding and respecting certain rules of what he called al-Umran al-Bashari. And he said these rules, he said, I am not aware that somebody else put them together the way I am doing it as a new independent discipline. He said, maybe in another language, but I don't have access to that. However, in what I have access to, I have not seen it, meaning anything basically written in Arabic or anything translated to Arabic, meaning, for example, either from the Yunan, from the Greeks, or from the Persians. He said that occasionally there are hints here and there, but nothing put together the way I am doing it. So he's very self-conscious about what he's doing. Now, here he will explain that what he's trying to do is to explain to us, and what you see in this plate, you have 8 you have element of a cycle. And he said that basically this is what happens in human history. Or so in the beginning, for example, you see the arrow. Yeah. So in where's the arrow, you have something like العالم بستان سياجه الدولة. So the world is like a garden that is protected by the state. Meaning basically the world needs the state. However, he said الدولة, the state itself, الدولة سلطان تحيا به السنة. دولة is a might, sultan here, with which it's either sharia or sunnah or law is, so for you to have law and order, you need a state. So الدولة سلطان تحيا به السنة. Then السنة سياسة يسوسها الملك. So a sunnah, or even if you take it in the sense of law, is a policy that the king or the head of state is responsible for, meaning for its dispensation, for its for making sure that it is respected. And then al-maliku, you see usually the last word in each section is the beginning of the other section. Al-maliku ra'in wa 'aduduhu al-jaysh. So al-malik, the king, the head of state, is a ra'i, meaning that he takes care of the people under him. However, he needs an army, meaning he needs those who will execute his decisions. So the last word here is al-jaysh. Then it said al-jayshu أعوان يكفلهم, or al-mal. Basically, the army, the security forces, they are sustained by income, al-mal, wealth. Then the last word was al-mal. Al-mal, so income is gathered from al-ra'iyya, from the population. Then the last word here, al-ra'iyya needs protection. And that's the word there is al-adl, justice. And then the next one, al-adlu ma'lufun wa huwa qawam al-alam. And justice is necessary and it is customary, and that's what makes al-alam works in an orderly manner. Then the cycle comes again. So we will stop here today, inshallah. I'm sorry, I was having a headache, so if I was a little bit not focused, just pardon that. But inshallah, if you have questions, let me know. Naam?
Is income gathered from states referring directly to taxes?
Yes, taxes, yes. Either Naam, also maybe questions from perhaps from the sister's side. Okay, if there is no question, salam alaikum. Thank you very much.